my findings on the officer-involved shooting that occurred in Olathe on June 3rd of this year. At the conclusion of my findings, I will provide you some brief factual basis in the reasons why supporting my findings. Additionally, there's going to be a complete report that will be available for you to review. We will also be providing to you some video of the actual incident itself. And then at the conclusion of this presentation, I will be available, as well as Chief Butad will be available to answer any questions that you would have at that time. So after a very thorough investigation done by the OSIT investigation team here in Johnson County, providing me a complete investigation and applying Kansas law, it is my finding and determination that the two Olathe officers were justified in their use of force that resulted in the death of David Sweet. These are all tragic situations, ones that no one wants to see happen. But the officers acted in accordance with state law, and that is my findings here today. I will let you know that prior to this press conference, I met with his family and discussed my findings with him, as well as providing them additional information and answering their questions. And I appreciated their assistance in allowing me to have a very difficult conversation with them. Just to give you a basic set of facts, and then I'll play some video for you. On June 3rd, in the early evening hours, a Olathe police officer conducted a traffic stop, which happens each and every day here, probably in the city of Olathe. His lights came on here in Olathe, not too far from this courthouse. Both vehicles then pulled southbound on Water Street, where then he began the process of doing a traffic stop. While he was doing that, Mr. Sweet showed up going northbound on Waters. You will see on the video he stopped in between the two cars going the opposite direction, backed up, and then turned his wheels to come up right next to the police vehicle. At that time, the officer started to get out of the car to figure out what was going on. Mr. Sweet then drove away. Almost exactly 2 minutes later, Mr. Sweet came back down that same road in that same direction and stopped between the two vehicles, the vehicle that had been stopped for the traffic infraction and the officer's vehicle. The officer had been struggling getting the ticket to print out, and so he was going to be getting out of his vehicle to inform the citizen that, hey, it's going to take a little bit more time for me to get you your ticket. And as he stepped out, he saw that vehicle once again stopped in the opposite lane of traffic. He then approached Mr. Sweet and asked if there's anything wrong. And then Mr. Sweet responded, yeah, and then unfolded a lock blade knife. The officer, as you will see in the video, immediately backed up, told him to stay in the car, asked for assistance, and stayed a safe distance away from Mr. Sweet. The video would then show that he was waiting for his backup to arrive. As the backup arrived, Mr. Sweet started to get out of the vehicle. The officer continued to back up to the passenger front of his vehicle. Between him and the second officer, they made multiple commands to Mr. Sweet to stay where he was, to drop the knife. Despite those repeated attempts and commands by those officers, Mr. Sweet then began to approach the officer. Officer number one, who was on the passenger side of the vehicle, and as he approached, both officers used their firearms and discharged the firearms until Mr. Sweet fell to the ground. At that time, Mr. Sweet collapsed and later died at the scene. The officers, between the two of them, one discharged his firearm 5 times, the other one 4. 8 of those rounds struck Mr. Sweet, and we'll provide a diagram of what that scene looks like. But it was based on those set of facts and the interviews of multiple other witnesses at the scene that I found that the officers were justified in the use of force. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and play some videos for you. You will notice that there's some redactions, so the faces of the individuals involved have been pixelated, as well as the driver's license of the vehicle that was stopped in the initial traffic stop. So first we'll start with the officers. They're broken up into two segments. His car camera, the first incident where Mr. Sweet pulls up to the vehicle, and then there's a second video of the second occurrence. This vehicle pulling up, this Ford, is Mr. Sweet's vehicle. You'll see him stop. The officer reported that he was mouthing something to him, but he couldn't hear because they both had their windows up. Then Mr. Sweet pulls back, turns his wheels, and comes right up next to the officer's car. Again, his mouth was moving. The officer didn't hear anything that was being said, and then shortly after pulling up to the vehicle and the officer starting to get out of the vehicle, Mr. Sweet pulled away. As I indicated, almost exactly 2 minutes later, Mr. Sweet again pulls up in this Ford vehicle, halfway between the vehicle in the traffic stop as well as the officer's vehicle. The officer was getting out to tell the individuals that he needed a little bit more time to get the ticket completed, and had this conversation with Mr. Sweet. Mr. Sweet produces a knife, and you can see the officer's response. Off to the left, eventually the second officer shows up, but you will not see that on the car camera. You will also hear from the body cameras, which will also have the audio after this. The second officer is here at the scene now. Shortly after where this is frozen, Mr. Sweet continues to move towards the officers, and that is when the officers discharge their firearms, as I indicated previously. This is the original officer.
Can I help you with something? Stay right there. Don't move. Don't move. Do not move. Stay in your car. Do not move. Can you make more units? Somebody's rolled up on here tonight. Do not move. Stay in your vehicle. Stay in your vehicle right now. Show me your hand. Drop it. Show me your hand right now. Drop the knife. Put it on the ground. Drop the knife. Put it on the ground.
That was the first officer at the scene, and then I will now play the second officer, who is his backing officer.
Show me your hands right now. Drop the knife. Drop the knife. Put it on the ground.
Now, during the investigation, next to Mr. Sweet's body was this knife. If you look closely at the officer, the first officer who approaches the vehicle, you can see that knife getting flipped open when the officer walked up to the car. This was the weapon that concerned those officers at that time. And then this is a diagram done by the Johnson County Crime Lab, which will give you an idea of the measurements. A traffic lane is about little over 20 feet in width. As I indicated during the confrontation, the original officer, as you saw from his body camera, was basically at the front passenger headlight of his vehicle, and then the second officer really came up and was on the opposite side of the vehicle up towards the front fender. You can also see that the distance after the shooting, that Mr. Sweet got within probably 7 or 8 feet of the officers before he fell and collapsed from the gunshot wounds. We know from training from law enforcement officers and from force science that once Mr. Sweet got inside that 21-foot range, which was about the width of the traffic lane, that was an immediate threat to those officers based on their training and experience. At the point where he collapsed, he was actually within 9 or 10 feet of each of these officers. And based on all the science out there, that is considered an extreme threat to law enforcement when you get inside that window, and it's based on reaction time. And the example I gave not too long ago was just like every citizen who drives down the highway, you see a car slam on their brakes in front of you, your brain has to tell your feet to hit the brake for you to stop, and there's a delay. Well, it's the same concept for these law enforcement officers and in force science, is that them having to make a determination there's a threat, and then having to immediately turn around and decide what course of action to take. There's that delay, and that's why the supposed 21-foot rule is coming into effect. It's how much time it takes for you to react and how much distance a person can cover to be a threat to you. So when you combine the factors of the distance and the actions of the officers, you can clearly see that the officers were justified in their use of force with a deadly weapon of an individual approaching them in that manner. So those are my findings. At this time, I'm going to invite Chief Butad, if you would like to make any statements, Chief, about this.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chief Mike Butad of the Olathe Police Department. Thank you for being here today. As always, being forced to take an action that causes the death of another is a tragic event. Our police department never desires for that to be the outcome. Unfortunately, that is a rare event. Our condolences go out to Mr. Sweet's family, as well as our thoughts and concerns for ongoing health for our officers' family, and our police department. Our police officers are very prepared to assist people who are experiencing a behavioral health crisis. That assistance happens several times every day in Olathe with great outcomes. Both of our involved officers completed crisis intervention training prior to this incident. However, regardless of the fact that 100% of our officers receive CIT or mental health first aid training, or that we were the first law enforcement agency in the entire Midwest to work with licensed therapists, better known as mental health co-responders, or that we were the first agency in the Kansas City metro area to have a dedicated behavioral health unit, this incident was rapidly evolving, and the actions of Mr. Sweet forced our officers into the only appropriate option of using force. As you just saw, this incident is very much out of the ordinary. It is rare for a police officer to be contacted by a person while they're in the middle of conducting a traffic stop, especially a person unrelated to the stop who quickly advances on officers while they're armed with a deadly weapon. We may never know why Mr. Sweet unnecessarily injected himself into this situation and made a litany of decisions that forced our officers into making a life or death decision within an incredibly short amount of time. Despite our best attempts, no police officer can ultimately control the decisions or behaviors of people we contact. Even the best trained and best prepared police departments cannot fully guarantee this type of outcome will never happen. We are grateful that our officers and the numerous citizens surrounding this incident were not harmed. And I would like to thank the Johnson County law enforcement agencies that contributed very experienced detectives who completed a thorough investigation. These professional investigations conducted by our Johnson County Officer-Involved Critical Incident Investigation Team provides our district attorney with significant factual information so he can make an appropriately informed decision. I agree with District Attorney Steve Howe's assessment of this incident. Although we never prefer to use force on a person, our officers' actions were legal, justified, and reasonable. Again, our condolences go out to Mr. Sweet's family, as well as our thoughts and concerns for the ongoing health of our officers, their family, and our police department. Thank you.
So we're going to go ahead and open this up for questions.
DA Howe, Chief, is there any explanation for this individual's behavior? I know you said that you may never know, but you've spoken with the family. Can you just give us
Sure.
some insight into maybe what caused this?
In talking with the family, he was suffering from mental health issues for a number of years. And the one thing that they indicated to me is like, we need to continue to work to find ways to help people who have serious mental health issues, so we don't have these tragic circumstances. And they understood that that played a role. But I think the chief was correct. We may never know exactly why Mr. Sweet chose to do that day, but they understood that mental health crisis that he was continually suffering from probably played a role in it.
Are you suggesting that it may have been a suicide by officer situation?
Well, I can't read minds, so I don't know what was going through his mind. I just know that with these set of facts, these officers did not know Mr. Sweet, did not know that he had potentially mental health issues. They just knew that there was a strange individual who was inserting himself in a traffic stop, who displayed a deadly weapon and then confronted them. That's all they knew. And, you know, the United States Supreme Court says we can't armchair quarterback law enforcement in hindsight. We know what they knew, which is they were confronted with an individual with a deadly weapon and they had to respond. And my decision is solely that decision, based on the facts that they had available to them, was reasonable and consistent with Kansas law.
And had Sweet had situations with officers in the past that may have suggested that something like this would have happened?
Go ahead.
Like the district attorney said, he was very unknown to our officers, and this is the first time these officers had seen him.
I will say that the family indicated that he was exhibiting some mental health issues, and so they were concerned about that. I don't want to delve into too much of that because that gets into some HIPAA issues that the family would have to waive. But I will say that they expressed that he was struggling with mental health issues, and you know, it was their belief that that played a role. But again, we can't read minds. It's not like the movie Minority Report where we know things ahead of time what someone's going to do. So all my job is to determine the officers, based on the facts they had available to them, was it reasonable for them to use deadly force.
I have a question for you, Chief, if I may. When you first watched the body cam footage, compared to what you had already heard and read about from the scene, what was your reaction, or how did you take with what your officers did and responded to this as it all unfolded?
You know, my reaction was it was just a very unfortunate situation, and you know, I was saddened that our officers had to go through that, as well as Mr. Sweet. I really wish that there was some more time. If you watch the video, again, you'll recognize by the time Mr. Sweet gets out of the car and force is used, it's only about 5 seconds long. So I really wish that we had more time to try to help him.
Oftentimes we see officers try to deploy some kind of less lethal force, like a taser. Can you maybe weigh on why that wasn't an option here?
Very similar to my last question. It only took 5 seconds. from the time he got out of his car. Really not a lot of time to deploy a less lethal option. That's really, if he would have been contained or not been advancing, that would have been an option. But when you have an armed person that's advancing towards you, that's really not a good option.
And I think there's a misnomer that a taser works every single time it's deployed. And in fact, from my work with law enforcement, more often than not, it doesn't work because it has to penetrate through clothing. And so if you're faced with somebody with a deadly weapon, Kansas law doesn't say you have to respond with a non-lethal. And the officers chose the lethal use of force, because they felt that their lives were threatened. And my finding was that was a reasonable belief on their behalf.
Chief, as far as the counseling goes for what the officers were receiving, can you just describe with what that's like and what you guys have been doing to make sure the officers' mental health is okay after this? How does that counseling all work in your department?
Yeah, I don't want to get into the exact details of it. We have a very robust wellness program, and they have been receiving some counseling through licensed therapists. We make sure that they're ready physically and mentally before they go back to work. Thanks for asking.
And one of the things the Sweet family wanted me to emphasize is they wanted us to call once again for more dedicated resources to help those who are mentally ill. And I think they were really cognizant of the fact that there's a little bit of a hole, which is if you're a involuntary commitment, danger to yourself or other, you can be lodged in a hospital and kept safe. But if you don't meet that threshold, but you have a serious mental health issue, there's no place really to go. And there's no place for those individuals. And I will say that that's why we're beginning to work on with the Johnson County Mental Health Department, coming up with a crisis center here in Johnson County. We just recently had a meeting with the hospital CEOs about doing a partnership where people like Mr. Sweet that maybe don't rise to the level of being dangerous, at least prior to this incident, having a place for them to go and to get help. And so we're on the ground floor of trying to work towards that, because we understand there's a hole in the system, and individuals like Mr. Sweet need help. So we don't end up with more of these situations, these tragic situations that have unfolded in this incident.
Did blood tests during the autopsy give you any other insight into maybe his behavior?
He had a small amount of a drug, but it wasn't a large amount, and it's consistent with what he was prescribed. So there wasn't any other indicator, such as being intoxicated by either drugs or alcohol, to play a role in this.
Chief, going forward, when it comes to officers responding to, and I know this isn't the case here, but when it comes to just dealing with anybody with a mental health crisis, has the Olathe Police Department gone through training to be helpful in those situations? What would you just advise in the future if someone's experiencing a mental health crisis?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can they turn to the police for help?
Absolutely. Like I just said, 100% of our officers are trained in either CIT or mental health first aid. We also have a specific unit that our behavioral health unit is called ACT, Advanced Crisis Intervention Team, that when they're on duty, they go immediately to a call when somebody's in a crisis. Not only do they have more training, but really what they have and their benefit is time, and they can be more creative and help people throughout their problem.
And that's the reason why we have co-responders in Johnson County, is to do that, triage the situation and get people help. The problem with some of these incidents involving law enforcement is it happens so quickly, it's not a secure scene, and we can't bring those additional resources in play. And that's the tragic circumstances that we deal with. Is the officers, they did everything they could with the limited time that they had, which is trying to provide distance and try to bring down Mr. Sweet so it doesn't become this type of tragic situation.
Do the bystanders play a big part in that too? I mean, we saw a car backing away in that video, obviously the person that was pulled over. I mean, how much did that play into this?
Well, and in fact, the officers indicated in their interviews that not only were they concerned about their safety, but the safety of the citizen in the car in front of them. And then also, as the second officer was coming up to support him, there was another citizen that was behind the first police vehicle. So you had multiple innocent civilians around there, and the officers noted that they were also concerned for the safety of those individuals as well.
Have you been able to piece together at all what Mr. Sweet was doing before this?
No, there's no indication. And in fact, the tragic situation is that both his family and friends said that he was not a violent individual. And so, again, that's what's so tragic about these circumstances is mental illness can cause people to act unlike their normal character or behavior. And we see that time and time again. And so, again, we had a very good conversation with the Sweet family. They've been working with him for a long period of time dealing with his mental illness, and it's unfortunate that it ended the way it did.
He had some connections with like some community groups. Was he homeless? Do you know?
No, he wasn't homeless. He lived a short distance away from here and was living a fairly normal life. And again, that's why it's so tragic is people who suffer from mental illness can sometimes fluctuate up and down as far as the degree of problems they're dealing with. I would suggest if you have any questions specifically about mental health and how people act, to feel free to reach out to Johnson County Mental Health. Tim DeWeese and his staff do an incredible job of talking about how individuals with serious mental illness may react to certain situations and how his co-responders that are embedded in law enforcement agencies do a really effective job of keeping people who are seriously mentally ill out of our jails and trying to avoid these types of situations. Thank you very much for your time. There's a handout that hopefully you've all received or that Melanie has for you. So if you will, as you check out, if you will stop by, there's the full report that's available to you as well, okay?
Are the video files going to be available to us as well?
We're not going to make the video files available other than what we just displayed.
Okay.
But hopefully you all got some good shots on that.